it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Timothy Walker. And as many of you know, I actually first saw Dr. Walker at a symposium in New Bedford, and it was a really sort of a life-changing event for me, which is, I'm sure everybody says that, but it really was. His research and the way that the information was presented, his perspective, just made me sort of rethink how we know what we know. So I'll leave it with that. Dr. Timothy Walker is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He's a scholar of maritime history, colonial overseas exploration, and transoceanic slave trading. I need glasses. Walker is a guest investigator of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, a contributing faculty member of the Munson Institute of Maritime Studies, and director of the NEH Landmarks in American History Workshop Series. And indeed, that's where we met. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Timothy Walker.
Good evening. Wow, I'm so grateful to be here in Newburyport. I live down in New Bedford, and I don't get to make it up to the North Shore very often, and whenever I come here, I'm reminded of why I should come more, because you have amazing things up here in terms of history. And so I'm really grateful to the Museum of Old Newbury for inviting me up, and to Bethany for arranging all of this. But I'm really grateful to all of you for coming out tonight on a very cold Friday to listen to me speak about this research. The cover of the book is here, Sailing to Freedom, Maritime Dimensions of the Underground Railroad. And I was the editor. I coordinated 9 other wonderful historians who I had the great pleasure to work with from up and down the East Coast. And over the course of several years, we put together this book to explore a really underappreciated and underexplored dimension of how the Underground Railroad worked. And so the story that I have tonight to share with you is, in a way, meant to get you thinking about very different ways that the Underground Railroad operated, and to kind of change your conceptualization of how the Underground Railroad worked. So let's jump right in. So this is a map. This is from National Geographic. It's now a map that's, I don't know, maybe 20 years old or so, but it kind of reflects how the Underground Railroad is generally taught in schools in the United States. And it reflects ways that we are taught to think about the Underground Railroad and how people escaped mainly over land. Now, there is a nod to people escaping along the eastern seaboard, but the scholarship of the Underground Railroad, the historiography of what's been written over the last 100 years or so, really doesn't look very much at the maritime side at all. It's almost entirely focused on the land-bound stories of the Underground Railroad, and that's how it's generally taught in K-12 education in the United States. But I want to push back a little bit and challenge some of the concepts that are embedded in this map. You know, maps have a language, and they teach us to think in certain ways. But here's the problem with this map, the biggest problem, is that if we're to believe, what this map is asking us to believe is that people are escaping overland on foot using wagons and horses, but mainly walking on their own 2 feet from the very deep south, from central Alabama and central Mississippi and northeast Georgia and the South Carolinas. The problem with that is that the historical data doesn't back it up. The historical record, in fact, says that almost every single successful documented escape by land began within a day or two's walk of the border with a free state. The problems, the logistical problems of escaping through what in effect was hostile territory, where there were organized posses of slave patrols out systematically looking for runaway enslaved people. The problems of people who were born and raised, as most African Americans were in the middle of the 19th century, born and raised in the United States. You know, the importation of enslaved people to the US legally was cut off in 1808. And so almost everyone by the 1840s and 50s that was enslaved in the South had been born in the United States, in the continent of North America. And so if they were in a plantation context, they didn't know much about the geography of anything north of them. They didn't have contacts. They didn't have networks of support. They didn't know where to take refuge during the daytime where they wouldn't be seen by people fleeing northward. And so the way that the Underground Railroad is often taught, where we have this idea that people are escaping very long distances over land, the historical record simply doesn't back that up because of the logistical problems of escaping by land. By contrast, though, if you consider someone escaping by sea, even out of ports of the very far coastal South, from Savannah, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Wilmington, North Carolina, or Norfolk, Virginia, and the Hampton Roads area, if an enslaved person could contrive to get themselves aboard a northbound ship, by the time they were 3 miles offshore, they were in international waters, because the United States only recognized a 3-mile limit on the coast at the time, and their escape, their flight, consisted of riding on a vessel. And that would be true if they were a stowaway, a genuine stowaway who had no help or complicity with the crew from a northern vessel, or if they were escaping with the knowledge and with the help of the crew of a northbound vessel, then their ride is even easier, because once they're offshore out of sight of land, they can come up on deck and basically enjoy the ride. Moving by land, your rate of escape would have been 10, 12, 15 miles a day by foot, maybe a little more. If you had a horse, you could go a bit further. But on a ship, you could go 120, 150 miles a day or more once you're out in the Gulf Stream moving northward. So a trip from the very furthest ports of the South to a free port in a northern state would have been a matter of, under the best conditions, it could be a matter of 5, 6, 7 days. And so almost every escape, documented successful escape that we have records of from the far South, every single one of them, with very few exceptions, is from a coastal port and escaping by water. So this is the kind of starting point, the conceptualization that I want to convey to you. But let's talk about how we know about this and what's the evidence. How do we know that this happened? But before we do that, I want to mention a couple of other things. This is one of the very earliest, this is a map from one of the earliest books about the Underground Railroad. It's published in 1898 at a time when there were many people who had experienced the Underground Railroad, both as conductors and operators of the Underground Railroad, and also people who had escaped on it. So William Siebert did a lot of his research by mail. He would correspond with people who had been involved with the Underground Railroad, either as fugitives or as assistants to helping people escape. And he tracked all of the escape routes that he could. He mapped them. And this map is often reproduced. So it's published in 1898. Now, I was born in Detroit, Michigan, which is a very important crossover point between the United States and Canada. But I grew up near Dayton, Ohio. And so I grew up being steeped in all of these stories of Underground Railroad escapes, because many of the important throughways went right through where I grew up. But when I came to the East Coast to go to graduate school in Boston, and then took a job at UMass Dartmouth down in the south coast of Massachusetts, I began to think a lot about the importance of the sea in this whole story, because I started hearing stories about people who had escaped from enslavement and then ended up in New Bedford, where I live. And that was a really interesting story. But the point about showing you this map is that at the end of the 19th century, in 1898, when this is published, William Siebert understood that most of the engagement with operatives of the Underground Railroad happened once people got into a free state, because that's where most of the Underground Railroad is operated, with some exceptions, and that was in ports port cities of the South. So the port that you can see there is Portsmouth in Norfolk, Virginia, where I was last weekend, by the way. I gave this talk down there, and they've opened an exhibition about the Maritime Underground Railroad down there, which I'm very excited about. And so if you're in that area, you can see it for the next couple of months. But the way this whole story really gets rolling is there is an organization in New Bedford called the New Bedford Historical Society, which focuses specifically on the stories of people of color in the New Bedford area. So African Americans, Wampanoag Indians, Cape Verdeans, the very multinational and polyglot community that forms around the whaling business in New Bedford. And it turns out that New Bedford, and I didn't know this when I moved there, but New Bedford was a real destination, a terminal point on the Underground Railroad. And it was a terminal point for a number of reasons. The whaling business was largely in the hands of Quakers who were overwhelmingly abolitionist, and they created a welcoming environment for people fleeing enslavement in the port of New Bedford. But the other thing that I didn't know is that New Bedford had the highest population of people of color prior to the Civil War of any city in the North in terms of the percentage of the population. The per capita percentage of the population was higher than anywhere else. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, they had more people of color, but not in terms of a percentage of the entire population. And so we started to ask ourselves, okay, why is this happening? And the answer had a lot to do with the whaling business, of course, but also the fact that there was a very active abolitionist community in New Bedford very early on. And the New Bedford Historical Society, which is led by a real dynamo of a woman named Lee Blake, who is an African-American woman, she approached me and said, look, we'd really like to tell this story to a broader audience. Would you like to collaborate on a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to teach this story? And I said, absolutely, sign me up. And so we, for several years, 2011, 2013, 2015, we brought in teachers from all over the United States, K through 12 teachers, and we taught them about this place, New Bedford, excuse me, and its unique story as an Underground Railroad hub. But in the course of doing that, we also brought in scholars who were telling us stories about how people arrived in New Bedford. And it began to dawn on us that, boy, this was a really important story about people arriving by sea, aboard ships, often as trained mariners, in fact, and usually arriving with some maritime skills because they're coming from working waterfronts in the South. Now, this is a book, Blackjacks, by Jeffrey Bolster, who's a colleague of mine. He used to teach in University of New Hampshire. It came out in 1997, and in this book, he established that roughly, just a little bit below 20% of all the mariners working in American-flagged vessels in the first half of the 19th century prior to the Civil War, almost 20% of all the mariners were of African descent. So about 18%, and so a real high percentage, usually free black men, but often in the South, enslaved black mariners who are turning their wages over to their owners. Now, working at sea, going up and down the East Coast of the United States, gave African Americans a tremendous opportunity to broaden their horizons. Often mariners had a pretty high rate of literacy. They could read, sometimes because they had to for their jobs. But more importantly, in some ways, they learned the geography of the coast, and they learned in ways that people inland didn't learn about where to find refuges in free states and how to get there. So this is a really important part of the story. The other real important part of the story is that in the American South, the antebellum South, along the waterfronts and in the ports, almost all of the work is being done by a workforce that is enslaved people of African descent. So, the waterfront laborers who are loading and unloading ships, and often the watermen themselves, are people who are enslaved. Now, yes, there are some free black men working in the ports. There are some women who are working in the ports. There are a sprinkling of people of European descent there as well. But if you look at the art and you look at the records, you can see that the population working in the ports and waterfronts is almost all enslaved people. What are they doing? What kind of work are they doing? They are waterfront dock and wharf workers. They're longshoremen. They're stevedores, loading and unloading ships, which means they know how to make hidey holes when they're packing cargo. They know where to hide inside vessels. And it's also really skilled work. Those of you who are mariners or sail, you know that the trim of a vessel is necessary to make it sail properly. And so to load a vessel properly was a skilled job, because that in turn then meant how well the ship was going to sail, how it functioned as a vessel. So they're longshoremen, stevedores, they're warehousemen, they are drovers and teamsters bringing supplies and provisions and cargo to and from the port. They are shipyard laborers who do the caulking, the rigging, the sail making. All of this is being done in the South by enslaved people. And so this gives them really important insights and strategic knowledge that they can then leverage if they decide to make a bid for freedom aboard a ship. They learn the rhythms of the port. They learn when ships are getting ready to clear harbor. They learn when the forces of law enforcement are present and when they are not, when they make their rounds. They learn when the officials from the customs are there to check on the cargoes and clear a vessel in and out of port. They know this stuff because they're watching very closely. And many of the northern shipmasters, the captains, were also very much aware that if they were, for example, anchored in a relatively obscure place, they would be approached openly by people who are enslaved saying, please take me aboard, get me to the north. And the enslaved people would know from the markings on the vessel where it was from, if it was from a northern state or not. Not only are they working in land-bound positions on the waterfront, but they are also, in fact, watermen themselves. So they are working as fishermen, they're working on ferries. There are hardly any bridges in antebellum America. You have to take ferries across rivers. And so they are ferrymen, they are lightermen. A lighter was a large boat that you used to unload or load a ship that was at a mooring or at anchor in the harbor, not on a dock. So this is really specialized work too, handling heavy cargo into a lighter. So they're lightermen, and many of them are deckhands. They are working as mariners, and some of them are really skilled. Even though they were pretty much prohibited from using the title of pilot, that was the skill that they did. They understood the maritime hazards, the nautical hazards of the complicated waterways of the South, of the coastal rivers of the South. And by the way, well, we can see this as we go forward. I'm sorry that you probably can't see this map very well, but this is a 1860 census map showing the heavily shaded areas are concentrations of enslaved population in the United States. And if you look, you can see that all along the Virginia Tidewater area and in the Carolinas, and I'll have a better map of South Carolina, but all of the waterways, most of the plantations are next to waterways because the way to take out heavy agricultural products is on boats. And the people who are operating those boats, carrying the agricultural produce from the plantations down to harbors where they can be put on bigger ships and taken to market, that's all being done by enslaved workers. Those waterfront workers and people who worked on the waterfront had an enormous advantage over people who are only land-bound plantation workers, or people who are working in domestic labor, or artisans who are working only domestically in jobs that have nothing to do with the sea. The water-bound workers, so they have strategic knowledge that equals opportunities for escape. And so the main argument of the book hinges on this fact that you have this enormous waterfront and waterborne working population that then has the chance to escape on board ship because of the circumstances of their working lives. This is just South Carolina, and you can see all these little waterways. They'd come down to Charleston and Port Royal and various other places. They penetrate pretty far into the interior until you hit the fall line. But all of that work is being done by watermen who are African Americans and enslaved. So, one of the contributors to the book is a guy called David Siselsky, who's based in North Carolina. He wrote a book called The Waterman's Song, Slavery and Freedom in Maritime North Carolina. And he was one of the people who came to our National Endowment for the Humanities workshops for teachers and really opened my eyes a lot to just how intensely the waterfront force of South Carolina, how much of it was enslaved people. And he did a lot of the work that was essential for the book to come into being. All right, so what's the evidence? How do we know that this is actually going on? And one of the things that we rely very heavily on are runaway slave advertisements. Beginning in the middle of the 18th century, 1740s, even a little earlier, and then going up right until the end of the Civil War, people who own property, human property, and their property escapes, they put ads in papers to try to recover their property. There are about 230,000 ads in American newspapers from the middle of the 18th century until the end of the Civil War. One of the problems with this is that they're not all gathered into one convenient archive where they can be digitized and be searchable. They're scattered all over the place. But the Library of Congress tells us, and I believe them, that there's about 220 to 230,000 of these ads. And there are a bunch that we don't even know about. We started looking at them systematically, and I can't tell you exact numbers or percentages, but the frequency with which we find references to escape by water is enormous. Thousands of them. And so here's just one example. This is from 1772. It's from the Virginia Gazette in Williamsburg. And it's about a guy named Phil. He's 5'9", he's about 20 years old, but he had worked as a mariner. And it says, as he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring him or carrying him off at their peril. So here we have a couple of big indications. One, a guy who's used to the sea is going to escape by ship. Makes sense. But there's also a potential penalty for the shipmaster. So they're already starting to erect laws and regulations that give teeth to the idea that anyone helping someone escape is going to suffer consequences. So let's look at a couple more of these. So this one says, absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday afternoon, Oni Judge, a light mulatto girl. So she's 19 or 20 years old. She's the property of George Washington. And Washington's agent, so he's serving as president in Philadelphia at the time, and one of his preferred household servants, Oni Judge, disappears. And what he writes, what he puts in the paper is, as she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board. So this is from Claypole's American Daily Advertiser, 27th of May, 1796. Washington lived another 3.5 years. He spent the rest of his life trying to get Oni Judge back. In fact, she did escape by water. She went down the Chesapeake from Philadelphia on board a ship and then turned north and ended up in New Hampshire. And she was interviewed later in the 19th century. She never went back to a life of enslavement. She passes away before the Civil War. But so she was technically property her entire life. But despite Washington's efforts, he never got her back. Here's another example. This is from 1810, Baltimore. This is a broadside that would have been posted in public. And we have a couple of things here. This is absconded on board the sloop Jolly Miller, guy named Jack, 5'8". His object is to go to sea and will be trying to ship on board some vessel bound out. Note below, all masters of vessels and others are forewarned harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. We see this again and again and again at any historic period you'd care to look at. People escaping from the coast on ships and ending up somewhere in northern harbors. By the way, the book only focused on the eastern seaboard, and we only focused on people escaping northward along the east coast. There's another book to be written, maybe by me, I don't think so, but from people escaping from the Gulf Coast and going south to the Caribbean or to Mexico, because Mexico had outlawed slavery and several of the islands of the Caribbean had outlawed slavery by the 1830s, and there are people escaping to the Bahamas, to the Caribbean, and to Mexico. We wrote really only about people escaping northward along the coast of North America. So here's one from the mid-19th century. This is about 1840 or so. This is two people, Mary, aged about 26 to 30, and another person, William. Both of them have had, for a long time, relations with the Negro fishermen at the bayou. So the owner class is constantly concerned and suspicious that the watermen are actually helping even people who are not maritime workers to escape. And in fact, they almost certainly were. When the owners put these indications in a runaway slave ad, they're pretty sure that they know what happened. Now, sometimes it didn't happen this way, but this is a very strong indication that it was happening a lot, and they knew that it was happening a lot. Another way, before I get to that, I'll just say another way that we know about this is going on. The local governments of port cities in the American South conceived of their ports as, port, Latin for door, but they knew that these were escape channels, that they were places out of which people were escaping in very large numbers. The governor of Virginia in 1840 says, I think we're losing about $100,000 worth of property from Virginia annually aboard ships. And that translates into 200 or 300 people a year. That's a lot of folks escaping by water. And they perceived their port cities as being sieves out of which there's a real brain drain and a financial drain. This was costing the owner class enormous money, but also they're losing some of their very best workers, people who have great knowledge and great skill working with the ships on the waterfront on which their economy depended. And so what do? They erect laws to try to stop this from happening. They were very concerned about free black mariners from the north coming down and encouraging their enslaved property to run away. And so one of the things they do is they try to restrict the movement of the black mariners. They pass laws saying, or ordinances saying that they have to stay aboard their ships when they're in port, and in some cases they even incarcerate them in the city jail while their vessel is in harbor, and they only let them out when their vessel's about to clear port and go. They also erect the means to search vessels. They give local law enforcement the power to go on board and search vessels. They set up stations to fumigate vessels, to burn vinegar, and there's another substance that they're burning underneath the deck to try to drive people out and create these noxious fumes below deck. Sulfur, that's the word I tried to get. And they have some success in this, but they're clearly very desperate to try to stop the outflow of people that they know is happening, but they're not willing to change over their workforce and rely on a paid white workforce on the waterfront. This is a cost of doing business. And so they kind of accept that, even though they try to stop it. This is another newspaper advertisement, but it's not a runaway slave ad. Instead, it's just the opposite. This is an advertisement placed by a ship captain, a master, from near New Bedford, and it's published in the New Bedford Medley or Marine Journal, 1797. And this is published in the aftermath of the first Fugitive Slave Act which is 1793. Congress passes a Fugitive Slave Act to try to create the circumstances so that anyone who ran away to a free state, as the northern states started to outlaw slavery, there had to be some mechanism in the federal law that said you have to return property to its rightful owner. So in the aftermath of this, ship owners became liable if they helped someone to escape, either knowingly, if they intentionally did it. So here's a great advertisement. I'm going to read this, and we kind of have to read between the lines so that we know what's going on here. So it says, at the top it says, legal notice. To all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Tabor, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from the York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford. That on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. I had nothing to do with it, didn't know he was on board, he just turned up on my ship, and you can't blame me for that. That's what he's saying. He's publishing a legal notice to provide himself and his crew and his vessel with legal coverage, legal cover, so that his vessel will not be confiscated, that his crew will not be prosecuted, and that he will not be prosecuted and forbidden to trade in southern ports. These were the things he risked by taking off this man. Let's continue. And this is where it gets really interesting. It appearing inconsistent for me to return, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him at this port, New Bedford. The weather did not allow me to stop and take him back to his rightful owner. I had to, the wind was blowing one way, I don't have an engine, I'm gonna, continue north. Now, I don't mean to make light of this, but his word as captain is law, and there's no one to contradict him. But he is presenting a legal argument in a newspaper that's going to keep him from being prosecuted. And under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, this was enough, this was sufficient to keep him out of legal jeopardy. So going back, he calls his name James. Is that really his name? We don't know. He's about 27 years old and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. Any person claiming him will know by this information where he is. This is a weekly publication. And while newspapers did circulate up and down the East Coast, Mr. Shackelford, if he indeed did own James, would eventually have gotten this news, but by the time he got it, James could be anywhere. He could be in Canada, could be in upstate New York. It's hard to say where James might have been, but legal notice has been given. So, any person claiming him will know by this information where he is, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing the property in my power, William Tabor, New Bedford, April 20th, 1797. There are lots of these kinds of advertisements. And whenever someone showed up on board a ship in this period, this was essentially boilerplate. The local newspaper had this advertisement already composed in type, and they would just swap out the names of the ship and the captain and so on. And the icon there, they reused this a lot. It's a kind of a caricature of an African person with an R on his chest for runaway. Right? So here's another one, and it's similar, but instead it's someone complaining about another local captain in New Bedford and its region. And this, in the South, people knew that New Bedford was a center of abolition. They knew that it was a center where African people were being harbored if they were fugitives. And so people in the South complained about this. This is one that's published in the New Bedford Medley, but it's from a Southern owner who's saying, you guys made off with one of my enslaved people, and this is what he says. The person who ran away, his name is Harry. Harry is supposed to be carried off by a certain Thomas Wayner of Westport in Massachusetts, a mulatto. Thomas Wayner was of mixed race, kind of like William Cuffey, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, there were a number of free black people or free mixed race people in that area who were ship owners and who were known to be helping with the process of taking people away. So a mulatto who traded here and cleared out as captain of a small vessel from Westport. He came to the port of Snow Hill, Maryland, where he got a load of corn and staves and cleared for Norfolk, Virginia, whence he said he intended for Westport, whither I suppose him to have gone. And so this owner is saying, you're taking away my valuable property. The law is on my side. I own this person. Stop with this illegal activity. But of course it carried on. The other way we know about this is from narratives. People, enslaved people who fled from enslavement, they often publish their stories. And what's fascinating about this is that of the 103 or so published narratives that are published in the second half of the 19th century of enslaved people, 70% of them mention waterborne escapes. 70%. And yet it's not been a focus of historical writing for the last 100 and something years. So this is a story, this is an illustration from a book called The Experience of Thomas H. Jones, who was a slave for 43 years, published in Boston in 1862. So he doesn't publish his story until after the Civil War begins. But he escaped in 1849. He'd been working as a longshoreman in Wilmington, North Carolina. And he managed to get aboard a ship called the Belle. It was a brig. And he did it without the consent or knowledge of the captain. So when they arrive in New York, the captain goes ashore to get a federal official to re-enslave Thomas Jones. And at that point, Jones constructs a hastily constructed raft, and the ship is anchored out about 2 miles, and he jumps into his raft and he tries, I'm sure his raft did not look as nice as this raft, and he's trying to make a desperate bid to get away from the people who would re-enslave him in 1849. And he's chased by the first mate and part of the crew, but he's providentially picked up by 2 northern sailors who had abolitionist sympathies. And they secret him away and get him into a safe place, and eventually the Underground Railroad operatives in New York managed to get him to New Bedford, and then later to Boston, and eventually he writes his narrative about his escape. Fascinating story. Another one, this is John Jacobs. He's the brother of Harriet Jacobs. He's painted here in about 1848, but he escaped to New Bedford in 1839. One of the first things he does when he comes to New Bedford is because he knows that he's being pursued by his owner. So he gets aboard, he changes his name, he gets aboard a whaling ship, and he's gone for 2 to 3 years on a whaling voyage. This was the other attraction of New Bedford. If you're an African American escaping from the South and you've got some nautical skills, you can sign aboard even as a green hand, a completely inexperienced sailor. They will take you on the crew, and you can be on the other side of the world for 2 years, hunting whales in the South Atlantic, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean. And you can earn some money because you're being paid essentially at the same rate as any other sailor at your rate of experience. And so when they come back, they might have a little bit of money if they're lucky, and they've been out of the sight of their would-be pursuers for a couple of years at a time. He becomes a very vocal abolitionist. He learns to read while whaling, and he ends up writing 2 slave narratives, and he's holding a copy of The Liberator. When he's painted, he's holding very, symbolically, William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, abolitionist newspaper, that was based in Boston, but there were connections between the abolitionists of Boston and New Bedford. His sister, by the way, Harriet Jacobs, that's another incredible story. She also escaped by water. She had hid in an attic for 7 years trying to get a ship, and she was secreted in one of the, I can't remember which port it was, but she's secreted in a port in the South, and she finally manages to get aboard a vessel and ends up in New Bedford as well, and they're reunited, which is just this extraordinary story. This is Elizabeth Blakely. She was only 15 years old when she escaped from Wilmington, North Carolina to Boston, 1850, and her story isn't published until the 1920s. She's still alive then. But she had unfortunately had a very long voyage. She was on the ship for almost 2 weeks, hidden away. She got terrible frostbite. She escaped in the winter. But she did survive, and she lived out her life in freedom in the North. We also get narratives from abolitionists. So this is a guy named Austin Bierce, who had been a very active Underground Railroad operative in Boston. And what they would do is when a ship came in from the south, they would send out a boat with an African-American woman on it selling cakes and pies and treats for the sailors. And she would inquire discreetly if there was any contraband on board the vessel. She would ask the sailors, an African-American sailor, if she could find one, and say, do you have any contraband on board? And if there was a fugitive, then they would send out a larger vessel in the middle of the night. This is 1853, and the vessel, this little yacht, is called the Moby Dick. Right after the book was published, he named his yacht that. And so Austin Bierce publishes a book called Reminiscences of Fugitive Slave Law Days in Boston, published in 1880. So a lot of this material is being published after slavery has been abolished. So let me make a couple of points as an aside that I'd like you all to keep in your mind when we're talking about this subject. One of the big problems as a historian is that this is illegal activity, it's clandestine, and people didn't talk about it very much because they didn't want any legal repercussions. So we often have to ferret out these stories by finding other means to know that it's going on, like the fugitive slave ads of which there are so many. But we also then, when people ask us, well, how many people escaped? Or, what kind of numbers, what kind of quantitative data do you have? It's really hard to say with any certainty because we often only hear about these escapes when people are caught. It makes the newspapers. We often hear, and many of the folks who made successful bids for freedom, they had the good sense not to talk about it so that it wouldn't ruin it for anybody going after. There's a famous story of Henry Box Brown. Have any of you heard of Henry Box Brown? He escaped. So he escapes by having himself boxed up. That's why he got the nickname Box Brown. He's 5'10", 200 pounds, or 5'9", 200 pounds, and he boxed in this tiny little box, and he ships himself to freedom. He has an accomplice who helps him out. But then once he got to the North safely, he started giving public lectures about it, and he became a celebrity, and people wrote about him. And Frederick Douglass was furious with him because he said, look, you're messing it up. Now you have closed this opportunity for other people who might have tried to escape in much the same way. And, but Henry Box Brown needed to make a living somehow, and so he continued talking about it, but it did make it harder for people to escape that way afterwards. There are some other amazing stories. So one of the key operatives in Philadelphia, in the port of Philadelphia, was a guy called William Still, who had a house in Philadelphia near the waterfront. His house is still there, you can visit it. And he writes a book in 1872, after the Civil War, The Underground Railroad, a record of facts, authentic letters, narratives, etc. And William Still, who was the youngest of 15 children, his parents had escaped to the north, he becomes this extraordinary Underground Railroad operative in the port of Philadelphia. And what makes him really different is that he kept a secret diary of most of the people that he helped. And in his book, that comes out after the Civil War and after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that outlawed slavery, he tells the story of hundreds, more than 600 people that passed through his safe house in Philadelphia. And a very large proportion of them escaped by water, and the illustrations of the book frequently show seaborne escapes. So here's a case of a captain, James Watson Fountain, who had a schooner called the City of Richmond. And that schooner was a packet schooner. It sailed a regular circuit, hitting various ports regularly up and down the east coast of the United States in the period prior to the Civil War. He's one of literally thousands of schooners, sloops, brigs that are taking commerce up and down the east coast of the US. And that's the other part of this story, is that almost all trade and passenger vessels and movement up and down the coast was usually by water. At any given time, there were hundreds of vessels at sea that could carry people to freedom. There were no highways. Most of the rivers weren't bridged. And so this seaborne traffic allows opportunities for escape. So Captain Fountain on the schooner City of Richmond is one of those guys. And this is an incident where he in fact had more than 20 people secreted on his little schooner. And the authorities in Norfolk, Virginia came on board and said, hey, we're gonna search your vessel. And he said, fine, search my vessel. Here, I'll do it for you. He grabbed an axe and he started to tear up his own deck. And they're like, okay, first of all, there must not be anybody here if this captain is gonna tear up his own ship. And so they left. They took his word for it. Well, it was a ruse, it was a bluff. And he got those, I think it's 21 people, he got them to safety in Philadelphia. And William still tells that story. Another instance is this one, this is an image which I really love because it really encapsulates so many parts of the Maritime Underground Railroad story. You have people being offloaded at a place called League Island in Philadelphia, which is a little bit outside the center of the city. And many of the Underground Railroad operatives are in fact people of color from the black population of Philadelphia, and they're loading them into carriages where the windows have been covered, so people on the street couldn't see inside to see who was there. And they're doing it at night. That's, maybe the sun is coming up, but I think it's the moon. It's the middle of the night. But the other point here, and this is really nicely illustrated in this picture, moving people by sea meant that you could take entire families at one time. You could move children, you could move women, you could move people who normally couldn't make a trip, an arduous land-bound journey. Ships allowed for entire family groups to be taken off together. And this is illustrated in this picture. And the story of this is related in William Still's book. This is another one. This is escaping from Norfolk. A guy called Captain Lee is taking several enslaved people to a larger vessel and where they're going to make their escape. Lee was found out and prosecuted and served prison time for this act. And so that doesn't have a very happy ending. But this one does. This is Robert Smalls. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but Smalls was a maritime pilot in Charleston, South Carolina at the time of the Civil War. And he's the pilot on what had been a cotton transport boat, but had been turned into a gunboat by the Confederate Navy. And so the crew was all black and enslaved, except for 3 white officers. And on the night of the 13th of May, 1862, those officers went to a party. And they left the boat in the capable hands of their loyal servants, who promptly absconded with the vessel. And Smalls, who was a young man, he's in his early 20s, it gets better. So he pilots the vessel out, and if you've ever been to Charleston, you know there are some really big forts that overlook the harbor, including Fort Sumter. And he knew the signals to give because he had been navigating the vessel under the white officers. He dresses, and they do this in the middle of the night, but he puts on the captain's coat and the captain's hat, and he's in the pilot house in the top of the vessel, and he knows the signals to give so that they can safely navigate out and appear as if they're on official business. So he takes the boat out to the blockading Union Navy, and they first stop at another wharf to pick up their families, which is great. And his wife had the foresight to bring a big white sheet so that the Union Navy wouldn't open fire on them as they approach. And so they fly this, after they're outside the harbor and away from the Confederate guns, they fly this sheet, and the Union Navy does not open fire on them, and they turn the vessel over. And all of the guys who were crew for this vessel are mustered into the Union Navy as able seamen. And he serves throughout the war. But then he later becomes one of the first African Americans elected to Congress during the Reconstruction period, and he buys the home of his former enslaver and lives in it in Charleston, South Carolina, and he serves in the House of Representatives several terms, and then later becomes the customs collector. After Reconstruction ends, he's protected by some local politicians, and he lives out his days. He passes away in, I think, 1911. But he becomes this incredible story of someone who leveraged their knowledge of the sea to get to freedom and make a new life for himself. This is a real famous picture of the Monitor, which you may have seen, but there's this African-American crewman right here. He'd only been aboard for a couple of weeks when the photo was taken, but he had run away as contraband. He stole a boat from his enslaver and came down the York River in Virginia, and is it the York River? No, the James River, sorry, and joined the Monitor, which was on blockade duty, and serves out the war. Another guy is this guy, Dempsey Hill, who did something very similar in Beaufort, North Carolina. He had been a very active and well knowledgeable waterman in the harbor at Beaufort, and he realized that the blockading ships of the Union Navy could really make use of the charts that were in the customs house at Beaufort that had all of the nautical perils of the complicated waterways around Beaufort. So he stole the charts, he hides them in a cemetery, and he then recruits a few of his waterman buddies, and a couple of nights later, they steal a pilot boat and they sail out to the Union blockade. He's also taken in, he and his friends are taken on as able seamen in the Union Navy. Prior to World War I, the Navy was integrated in the United States, and the US Constitution had black and white and Native American sailors, and so the maritime forces were often integrated in ways that land forces were not. Later, he becomes a well-respected waterman in Buzzards Bay, and he takes people out on pleasure cruises and fishing cruises. So much, he's so respected that when he passes away in the late 19th century, he gets a pretty big obituary in the Boston Globe. And so two local newspapers, including the Globe, tell his story, and he was a very, very well-known waterman in Massachusetts, where he settled after the war. Well, I want to finish up tonight by talking a little bit about New Bedford, that is now my home. And as I mentioned to you, New Bedford had a reputation for helping out enslaved people. So here's a runaway slave ad from Maryland in the 1840s about May, a Negro girl, and who was called Jane Pennington. Sorry, 1st of May, Jane Pennington is her name, 20 years old. The probability is she has gone towards New Bedford as she has a father living there. So we know that people are going to New Bedford. Why New Bedford? New Bedford had a name. It was known as the Fugitives' Gibraltar. And it was a name that was coined prior to the Civil War because of this large abolitionist population, black and white. There were groups of abolitionists working in New Bedford, and also because of the whaling business. Of course, this is at the peak of the whaling period, where there are hundreds of ships annually sailing out of New Bedford and its sister port, Fehlhaber, just across the river. And more than 10,000 sailors a year are working through New Bedford on the whaling vessels, each of which had a crew of 25 to 30 guys. So there was always a need for labor. Most people went on one voyage and quit because it was such dirty, nasty work and dangerous. But there was always a need for more sailors. My colleague Catherine Grover wrote a book called The Fugitives' Gibraltar. She also contributed to my book that I edited, and she has done extraordinary research about the African-American community of New Bedford. But there were predecessors too. This is Absalom Boston, born in 1785, dies in 1855, born on Nantucket. He's mixed race Wampanoag American, and he's the first captain to sail a whale ship with an all-black crew. He's the commander. There's a guy called Skip Findley who's based in Martha's Vineyard currently, who wrote a wonderful book called Captains of Color about the whale ships that had black captains. But this guy becomes a major abolitionist in Nantucket. Paul Cuffey, who I mentioned earlier, born in 1759, dies in 1817. By the early 19th century, he is certainly the wealthiest person of color in the United States. He has shipping interests, whaling interests. One of his ships with an all-black crew is one of the very first American flagged vessels to go trade in London, sailing up the Thames River in London to trade after independence. And the London papers remarked on this. So that was his boat. It was a brig called the Traveller. And he also founds the first racially integrated school in Westport. So the foundations of abolitionism in that region, Westport, New Bedford, are often people of color who are, oh, and by the way, he sues the state of Massachusetts for the right to vote in the aftermath of the American Revolution. He was a property owner, but he was prohibited from voting because he was a person of color. He sued and won the right to cast a ballot. This is you can't read this, of course, but this is a crew list from his son, William Cuffey, in 1837, and it's a whaleboat, and everyone on board is a person of color. And we have, really strong records about various voyages that they went out on. The New Bedford Historical Society has its headquarters in this building, which is the Nathan and Polly Johnson House. Nathan and Polly Johnson were people of color, they were abolitionists, and they gave refuge to Frederick Douglass when he comes to New Bedford as a young man, 21 years old, in 1839 or 38, and he lived with them in this house right next to the Quaker Meeting House from the 18th century. Although by this time, there was a new one across the street. You can't see it, but it's built in brick. That's the new Quaker Meeting House, which is still in operation, and it was built in 1822. And right in front of this building now, so this whole region in New Bedford has been designated a National Historic Site, and it's called Abolitionist Row because we can document that whole street was made up of people, sometimes of color, sometimes people of European descent, but they were abolitionists, all of them, and they worked very hard to give refuge to people who had escaped to New Bedford. So Frederick Douglass shows up in 1838, and he arrives. He escaped using a nautical ruse. He had a certificate identifying him as a sailor, a free black sailor. And even though he didn't escape by sea most of the way, he did use ferries and various boats. He went by train, and he looked the part. He dressed like a sailor in order to escape with his young wife named Anna. And he came to New Bedford with the skills of a caulker. He knew how to do caulking, the means that you keep ship hulls watertight. And when he arrived, he wasn't able to break the color line in New Bedford when he arrived. There were white caulker crews that didn't want to work with black men. But within a decade of his arrival, that color line had been broken, and people who were black caulkers were then working on the New Bedford waterfront. But he got other jobs on the waterfront, doing various things. He worked in a foundry. He loaded and unloaded ships. This is a similar paper to what he had. This is a seaman's protection paper for an African-American guy named Israel White, a free black man. And Douglass had borrowed one of these in order to slip through. And it was common enough. There were enough African-American sailors that no one batted an eye. They just looked at him. He was dressed like a sailor, looked like a sailor. He walked the walk, and apparently nobody checked his credentials. He just waltzed through because he looked the part. And this was possible in the days before, photographs and digital technology that would not have allowed him to do that. This is the New Bedford waterfront. From this exact spot, today you can get a ferry to Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard, but there was always work for coopers making barrels because that's what all the provisions went into, and the whale oil that came back. There were always ships fitting out, getting ready to go back out to sea because the only way these whaling vessels made money was when they're hunting whales. So they were in port for as little time as possible before they would turn around and go out for another 3 to 4 years. Longest whaling voyage on record, by the way, 11 years. Yeah, imagine being the guy who signed up for that. And some of these guys, when they filled up their ships, they would ship oil home, and then they'd keep whaling if they were having good luck. This is the New Bedford Harbor in the 1860s, at about the end of the Civil War. And a couple of other quick points. People who escaped contributed enormously to the economy and the culture of New Bedford. This is Lewis Temple, who has a statue in front of the City Hall and the library because he invented a particular kind of harpoon. He was a blacksmith, and he created a harpoon called the toggle head harpoon, which meant that the percentage of whales captured after a successful strike of the harpoon went up because the harpoon had the quality of staying in the blubber. It didn't pull out as easily. He invents this, doesn't patent it, unfortunately, but he does invent it, and he sells a lot of them, and he's remembered as the guy who revolutionizes. But he had escaped from North Carolina sometime in the 1830s. And if you look at the art of the American whale fishery, African Americans are front and center all the time. The first time I went to the New Bedford Whaling Museum was probably sometime in the 1990s. And the story told at that time was largely focused on people of European descent. But much to their credit, in the last 30 years, they have broadened their perspective and been much more inclusive. So now you can read about Cape Verdeans and Wampanoag Indians and people of African descent who escaped from slavery in the New Bedford Whaling Museum. And it's a much more inclusive museum now. But the artwork is the tell, because, you've got people, there's at least 2 or 3. Here's a boat steerer who's a person of African descent. Here's someone clearly of African descent, but there's several crewmen who are people of color in this artwork. And in this one too, you see it several times, just repeated over and over. So it's kind of hidden, the story is hidden in plain sight if you're willing to see it. My final slide is, this is the New Bedford Whaling Museum. I expect all of you to come down and visit us. I really hope that you will. But for 6 months last year, we had a nice exhibition that was up. They were very kind to host an exhibition focused on the Maritime Underground Railroad. That exhibition is no longer brick and mortar live anymore, but we do have it online, and you'll be able to see it there. And they've just mounted the exhibition down in Portsmouth, Virginia, so it's going to be up there for a couple of months. And we're probably going to have it in, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but we're really hoping that Martha's Vineyard will also have it in 2024. So there will be other opportunities to see it. Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for your time. I want to see if there are any questions, so let me just check my chronometer here and see how we're doing. I have time for a few questions if folks would like to ask them.
All right, I have to put them on the microphone, I've been told.
Okay.
Okay. I saw your hand first, sir.
There are questions.
Timothy,
Yes.
why was the Maritime linked to the Underground Railroad either ignored or not discovered previously?
It's a great question. I've often tried to answer that myself, and I think it has to do with a number of things. In the 20th century, we start to build railroads, and we build bridges over the East Coast rivers, and the economy of the United States starts to shift away from the sea. And more importantly, historians like me are no longer trained with a maritime dimension to their historical training, or training as historians. And maritime history kind of fell out of fashion after World War II. And so a lot of my colleagues, so I come to this, yes, I'm a Midwesterner, but I moved to New Bedford first to crew on a large historically rigged sailing vessel, the schooner Ernestina. And I'd been sailing out of Mystic, and I'd done a lot of maritime stuff in my own life that then kind of naturally gave me the perspective that allowed me to see the importance of some of these documents. But I think a lot of working historians today don't have that nautical maritime perspective. There are some who do. Marcus Rediker is one, and there are others who have who do look at this stuff. But it's just coming back to we're only beginning to reappreciate the importance of the sea to American history in the historical professions. So there are a number of reasons, but I think that's a big part of it. Sure.
This is just an aside.
Yes.
Are you still reading Moby Dick?
So, the New Bedford Whaling Museum does a 24 or 25-hour Moby Dick marathon every year, and I read whenever I can. I like those middle of the night sessions. I'll get up at 3 in the morning in January and go down just like Herman Melville did, and I imagine, and I love to read the Moby Dick whenever I can. Thank you.
Could I ask, this is very enlightening. I had no idea about the... Okay. Thank you. This is very enlightening. I had no idea about the maritime concept of it. Could you describe how did, in the lexicon, that it's referred to as a railroad?
Yeah.
The Underground Railroad. You did use at the very end Maritime Underground Railroad for the first time.
Yeah.
But how did railroad get into it?
So that term, Underground Railroad, was current in the antebellum period. People talked about this Underground Railroad, and so the owner class in the South needed to describe that their property was disappearing in ways and leaving in ways that they couldn't account for. And so they coined this term. It was as if people were escaping underground on some sort of railroad and they would turn up in the north. It was never meant to be literal. It was always figurative. And is it Colin Whitehead who just came out with the book that then got made into a... So I think a lot of people think that there was this literal underground rail system, and no, it was always meant to be figurative. But it is current. It's contemporary with the 1830s and 40s when people start using this idea. And of course, railroads were brand new then as well. Some of the very earliest track laid in the United States, and it becomes more and more important during the 19th century. But railroads were something new, and I think they kind of embraced that word because it was this new technology by which you could travel at, previously unknown, ungodly speeds of 30 miles an hour or something like that. And so people just were sort of entranced by this extraordinary new technology, and they used that term. But it's not a real railroad.
I read Colin Whitehead's book, and just by the way, he doesn't treat the Underground Railroad, for those of you who haven't read it, as a metaphor. He treats a railroad as a real thing that ran underground. Right. So he had some fun with that, I think. Yeah. Just a question for you. You mentioned William Lloyd Garrison in your lecture. Are you aware he lived in Newburyport? He was born here and lived here for 15 years?
I am aware of that, yeah. That's not why I mentioned him. But yes, you guys can claim him, and you should. He's a spectacular fellow, I think he should be better. I think he should be better remembered. Like, I never heard his name growing up out in the Midwest until and Ohio was a center of abolitionist activity too. Oberlin College, and there are various places, especially in Northeast Ohio, where there were a lot of New Englanders who came out. They had a strong abolitionist root, but I didn't know much about this from my own education in Ohio. I saw another hand, I think. Yeah, here.
Oh, hold on. I'm coming with the microphone.
Going back to your growing up in Ohio, wasn't Salmon P. Chase an abolitionist? I know he had nothing to do with the lecture that you just gave, but you said that you hadn't heard of William Lloyd Garrison before.
I mean, I had heard of abolitionist newspapers. I may have heard the name, I'm not sure, but I didn't know the significance really until I came here and really started looking at this. And this is not going to answer your question, but let me just say this.
It's okay.
I came to this subject, if you look at my scholarship and my publications, I didn't work on this subject at all until relatively recently, about a decade ago. And I was doing most of my work on, the reason I ended up in New Bedford is because of the Portuguese community that's there, and the fact that I had done most of my doctoral work and my research in subjects of Portugal and the Portuguese overseas empire. But I was also a maritime historian, because you have to be if you're going to do the Portuguese. So when I moved there, I was literally 100 yards from the Whaling Museum when I first moved to New Bedford, and I began to realize that there was this extraordinary cache of archival material, the whaling logbooks and all of that, and I really wanted to develop that because it was in my backyard, and I wanted to better understand the community in which I was living. And so that's when I started to turn my attention to this. And when the New Bedford Historical Society asked me to collaborate on the Sailing to Freedom project, I jumped at the chance because it really allowed me then to develop this new field of scholarship. But Salmon P. Chase, yeah, he was definitely sympathetic to the abolitionist movement. But I'm not sure. I don't know his resume in that regard, so I'm not sure how active he was. So I can't answer your question. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. That's the important thing. Right. Thank you.
All right.
Well, everybody. Oh, please.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think we have time for one more, but is that okay?
Thank you very much for this. Do you have a sense from your research about fluctuations in the number of people over a period of time? Did the Fugitive Slave Act quash or limit that? Did the Emancipation Proclamation change it? How did that work?
Yeah, so if anything, the number of people who flee after 1850 starts to go up, although it gets harder, and the operatives of the Underground Railroad have to be much more careful because the law now has bigger teeth than it had in 1793. But another thing starts to happen, which is fascinating. In New Bedford, we can look at the census records from 1840 and 1830 and 1850. And as soon as it becomes clear that there's going to be this new Fugitive Slave Act in 1850, the black population of New Bedford in the 1850 census starts to report their birthplaces as the North. So if you ask them in 1830 or 40, you have an extraordinarily high percentage of the population that says, yeah, I was born in South Carolina, I was born in Georgia, I was born in Virginia. But after 1850, they start to claim, and it's the same people because you can track them, they start to claim that they've been born in New York or Boston or someplace in a free state so that they could plausibly deny that they had been born into a state of enslavement. And they also changed their names at a higher rate, kind of like Frederick Douglass did. You know, his birth name and the name he grew up with was Bailey, and he changed his name to Douglas once he got to New Bedford. And that's fairly common, and it makes it a little harder to track people. But we can do it in many cases. And so I hope that answers your question. It does change a lot. So everyone, I'm so grateful to you for coming out. Thank you. And, this is a lot of fun.